Life is complicated. The world is complicated. And in making decisions, we have to simplify it. And it's important to simplify. It's important to categorize. It's important to filter out the things that might make things confusing or might throw us in a state of not knowing what to do, not knowing what's important, not knowing where to go. Yet, in this increasingly complex world, we have to take responsibility. We have to take responsibility for, as individuals, to really get to know and get to the bottom of these things if we wish to be of consequence, if we wish to actually act in the world, which I think most of us would say, yeah, I want to act in the world, why not? Now, the problem is that it is not apparent at which level we are supposed to address these different problems. Now, let me put it in, give you a little more context on where my mind is and what I'm trying to do, because I'm trying to work this out as I record this. I'm thinking that we have a lot of problems, but we also have a lot of good things happening, right? And at the risk of talking about the problems, not out of a feeling of this isn't good enough or not being grateful for what is good, but rather, well, what are we going to work on if it's not the problems? Not to say and throw the baby out with the bathwater, but since we are working on something, we might as well work on something that needs to be worked on, right? So, just recently, a kid committed suicide, shot himself at a school close by here. We are seeing more and more things like that. Again, at the risk of over-highlighting those things, because when kids do not shoot themselves in school, we don't hear about that, right? However, I think it is important to know that when you hear something like that, when you hear things like depression, things like the opioid crisis that we are seeing in the U.S., we can tell that there are some things that could be better, could be fixed. And especially what's important to me in those cases is perhaps the thought from anybody that goes something around these lines: I just don't understand, or I don't see how, or I can't imagine. And see, I have a problem with those statements, because if we can't imagine these things, right? If we can't imagine what depression is like, if we can't imagine what maybe losing your job, being a middle-aged man or woman, and then spiraling in a vortex of meaninglessness, right? Then we have a problem. And the way that I'm sort of conceptualizing this is as far as levels of abstraction. Now, you've never heard of levels of abstraction. It's just a phrase to refer to going more specifically, zooming in and zooming out. That's all it is. Now, this particular model of kind of like segmenting it out like that, I was just reading something on computer programming, which the highest form of abstraction is actually the user, right, when we are working on our computer. And the lower level of abstraction, you can think of it backwards too, but would be like the zeros and ones that are making the machine work, right? The binary code that's making the machine. And then somewhere in the middle, programmers at maybe low-level programmers closer to the zeros and ones are down here, and maybe like user interface people are up here, right? But they deal with this whole process. So I thought well, what is the level? What are the levels of abstraction of action? What are the levels of abstraction of decision making? What are the levels of abstraction of analysis? Whether we're talking about personal, individual, or collective. We're talking about society, right? So how can we approach a problem such as suicide rates? How can we approach a problem such as opioid crisis? How can we approach a problem such as political polarization? And I'm seeing a lot of that, and you might know that I'm Colombian, and in Colombia there's a presidential election going on, and it's very interesting to see the parallels between the Colombian presidential election and the U.S. presidential election, with both sides, almost not talking to each other and basically insulting each other, which is kind of interesting in a sad and sort of satirical way, that you need the other person's vote if you want your candidate to win, right? You should, in theory, be trying to convince or win over the other side. Even if you win, there's going to be a large part of the population who agrees with the other point of view. So the same thing has happened in the U.S. There's a lot of people who obviously agreed or at least voted for Donald Trump. And then there's another large part of the population who agreed or voted for Hillary. And then the problem is that the campaign was really a smear campaign against the other candidate, as opposed to for whatever ideas, whatever things are happening. And then, okay, one of them won. Great. So what do you do now? Well, they're not doing much. It's almost like still the same. They're idiots, and then the other side says, no, you're idiots, and well, nobody's going to win you over, right? So I have a bunch of people who are posting stuff about each political side in the Colombian presidential election is the same thing. Look how stupid they are, and look how how much of violent or ignorant, or you can't really get anywhere, right? It's almost like telling your girlfriend or boyfriend, you've always been like that and you're never going to change. Like, what do? You punch him in the face. What are you going to do? There's no solution possible, right? This is the way I've always been. That's what you're telling me, and I'm never going to change. So you don't even want to try it. So and so this is very, and what happens is that emotions, which are an important part of our framework as human beings, right? We must realize. So like there are guys out there like Sam Harris, for example, and other sort of very almost worshiping the rational, right? Almost like the rationale was or is the thing that can guide us. And I'm not saying rational things are not powerful. They are, but we are not rational creatures, or at least we're not exclusively rational creatures. We're emotional creatures. We're motivated creatures. We are self-interested creatures. We are complex creatures. And just because somebody tells you something, there's not apparent that you should assume that they're telling you the truth about their motivation. Not because they are lying to you, although that is a possibility too, but because they might even be lying to themselves. And if you ever told yourself a lie, and I'm sure you have, I have too, as soon as you tell yourself a lie, you hear this voice in your head that says, wait a minute, that's a lie, that's not really true, or some kind of conflicting thing, right? Which is it's a very interesting phenomena, and actually we don't know anything about that. Like I don't think there's been any studies that I've certainly come across about the inner voice that somebody hears, but everybody hears that. But you may hear it the first time, but if you keep telling yourself that same lie, there's a point where you basically, and this is neurologically or neuroanatomically, what's happening, you literally create a machine inside of your head that will repeat this lie that eventually you'll believe because you practice it. And so there will be a point where, especially if you start lying to yourself about something, and hey, we all lie to ourselves about stuff, but then that tells us that our consciousness, our mental frameworks are a lot more fragile and a lot more vulnerable to abuse, external abuse, and self-abuse, right? So that was a long roundabout way of saying we need. So like when I'm talking about the levels of abstraction here, I'm going from the more specific things. So like down here you would have action. This is what we actually do, or you might even say this is what we actually say. Or what we actually write. That's a level here somewhere, right? And then as you go up, you have these things. But what's interesting to me is that they're not self-exclusive. So like a thing here can impact every other level. So let's run through the levels real quick and see if you can help me figure this out. And like I said, I'm figuring it out as I go. And these videos are a way of me sort of putting some stuff out so I can get it out of my head, but also get some feedback, so that's good. So this is the level of action or of motor action, I guess. It's very hard to get any more high resolution than motor output, right? Punching somebody in the face, right? That's something. But then that's a reflection of maybe an objective level of abstraction. And when I mean objective, I don't mean like objective as in the opposite of subjective, but objective as in a specific, as in an object or an event, right? And then, so this, you could say that this is almost the same level, I guess. Action, object, event. This was what is actually happening in the world, right? And then one level up is the personal, so you can think about that. About your interpretation about what is happening. What does that mean, right? And then one level above that is sort of the philosophical layer, which would comprehend analyzing things as such. So if you're thinking about, let's say this is going, and I don't know why this example popped into my head right now, but let's go with it. This is a date, right? And then the event is a date, right? So you're behaving in a date, right? The personal would be your interpretation of why, as a person, that's important for you to go on a date, because maybe you were attracted to the person, maybe you like the person, maybe you want to have a relationship with the person, right? The philosophical would be, why are relationships important in the grand scheme of things, not just for you, but you know, why would you want to be with somebody as opposed to by yourself, right? And then these are your philosophical sort of underpinnings that were given to you. See, the problem with a lot of these things is that a lot of these things are, we don't create these things, and because we can't. The way that I opened this video is exactly that. The world is complex. We can't create everything that we ever want to do or want to think about from the ground up. So a lot of these have been given to us. And then the highest level of abstraction would be something that you might call religious. I don't know what else to call it, because really when we're talking about this higher level of abstraction, we're talking about good and evil, I guess, or good and bad, right? So, because see, if we don't have that, and I guess one of the reasons that I'm thinking about this is because, and in my book I write about this, is because the educational system is so focused on this layer, okay? We're going to give you ideas, we're going to give you knowledge, right? And I wrote here knowledge, as opposed to wisdom as you go up, right? And that is so important, because knowledge is just knowledge, and what more knowledge can we get than having access, for example, to the internet? And that's good, but just to give you an example of knowledge versus perhaps wisdom. So during the Soviet era. The Soviet era is anywhere from like 1920s to like the 1950s. Some Soviet scientists were trying to mix, I believe it was smallpox with Ebola. So the idea was to have Ebola be able to be transmitted as easily as smallpox, right? And so from the scientific point of view, from the objective, and if you see, I map these out. So objective and event, sort of motor action, would be as far as science is concerned. And so we're gathering data. We're gathering, and the reason that I'm sort of separating this is because action sort of comprehends all of them at once, I believe. I think this is why. Because you can gather knowledge, a lot of knowledge about something, but it doesn't really tell you if that something is good for you or bad for you, right? Because that's something over here, maybe the philosophical, religious, depending on what it is, right? So if we're talking about relationships, right? And then of course there's a layer, maybe there's a layer that's cutting across that we can call something like human nature, which comprehends biological necessities, but also psychological, maybe emotional and motivational layers, right? That are sort of on top. And then there's some sort of malleability, right? We can sort of influence the way we feel and the way we think about certain things, but to a certain extent. We're not infinitely malleable. I mean, we would like to be. You know, we January 1st, just recently, or a few months ago, people probably said, I'm going to go to the gym 3 times a day and eat healthy. But I can probably say, well, how is that? How is New Year's resolution? We're in the middle of the year. How is that going? And so we've all tried to tell ourselves to do certain things, and we've failed, right? So, anyways, I thought that's I'm thinking that's how I'm working this out. So, going back to the example of the Soviet Union. So, when they were trying to mix Ebola with smallpox, as a scientific inquiry, right, as an experiment, there's really nothing really wrong with it. Not at this level, right? Because why wouldn't you want to try to mix two things to see what happens? Maybe you can do it, right? Now, if you're watching this video and shaking your head, you're probably like, no, that sounds like a really bad idea. And I understand what you mean, but it doesn't sound a bad idea in this level. It sounds a bad idea for me, maybe starting the philosophical layer, and of course, in the more, religious, if you want to call it that, and more good and evil, right? Like, why would anybody want to mix two diseases like that? Why would anybody want to make Ebola spread really easily, right? And yeah, I'm with you. I understand. So that's what I mean about knowledge versus wisdom, because you can use a lot of knowledge to bring about something like that. But would that be showing wisdom? Would that be showing any kind of moral compass that you would say, yeah, this is where we should go, or like, no, we shouldn't be going there, right? So that's sort of how I'm working this out. So when you see, for example, and this is the problem, a student shoots himself at school, and you think, well, what is the solution? It is very tempting. It is very tempting to succumb to an ideology, to a political ideology or religious ideology, or some kind of simple oaken razor solution that will, seems like, fix the problem, right? So you will see somebody say, well, we need gun control, which I'm not saying let's not be for gun control. I think it's good to be reasonable in any area that you're able to be reasonable in, and I think reasonable laws as far as guns would be a good idea, right? But again, the level of analysis is very important, because what happens is that since this gets really complicated And the problem is that this is becoming more and more taboo to talk about philosophical things, and certainly to talk about religious things, right? So and in school we're not really taught. We're not really these are not levels. And you know, if you think about, and this is, you know, this is very close to my heart. When you talk about art, for example, and I think this is one of the most important things about art, because I think art really cuts across this really nicely, even in a very ambiguous or abstract manner, because it does. So I think there's a phrase, I think it was Schopenhauer, who said that science, so science, which is down here, it's the universal that contains many particulars. But then he said art, so let's put it out here. He said art is the particular that contains the universal. Which also reminds me of Gustav Mahler. He said that the symphony had to be like the world. A symphony had to be like the world, which, and then he went to explain, his next sentence is, it has to contain everything, right? It's almost that wholeness in the particular, right? So, but this takes effort, and this takes like real education. This takes like really thinking about it and talking about it and having other people interested in. So let me ask you this. So we can sort of figure out where these things are, and some of the things that I'm talking about here, I mapped them out here. So like when we study science, when we study the empirical sciences, this is about the level of abstraction where we are. And of course, the question is, why are we studying science, right? So the personal thing would be, well, our personal motivation, well, if it's just getting a degree, right? That's probably the worst reason to study science, right? And then the philosophical is, why is science important as such? So it's funny because scientists, they will tell you, or some scientists will say, well, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in anything, but I believe in science, or I believe what science tells me, which I understand exactly what they're telling me. Well, what's interesting about this is that the fact that they are pursuing empirical science, which is a very powerful thing, and certainly the fact that you're watching me through camera and through the internet shows, it's evident, the power of scientific inquiry. But the problem, or the not the problem, but the interesting thing about that is that, why do they want to do science in the first place? It's almost like that motivational and that emotional thing. It's almost like, well, it's already implicit. It's like, well, why is it implicit? Who says it's implicit? You say it's implicit? Just because you're not aware of your particular motivations that led you to study science, it doesn't mean that they're not there, exist, and that you might have even inherited them. So anyways, that's the scientific, the empirical science domain, you could say, okay? Now, I thought, so when we're dealing with personal, what are we talking about? And maybe inside of person, like I said, I'm trying to work this out as I make this video. Maybe the personal side is, and I wrote here psychology, because especially now, with the breakthroughs that we've had in psychology, neuroscience, neuroanatomy, machine learning, which is very interesting. I think it was Richard Feynman. He was, I think he was a physicist, and he gave a bunch of lectures in Harvard, and and so there are books, and I've read some of them, which are really interesting. One of the quotes he says, and I think I wrote it in my book, one of the things he says is, that which I cannot create, I do not understand. So it's not until after we have to actually make something, create something, that we actually have to understand it fully, right? So this makes me think about, like, in the 1950s, where 1950s, 1960s, when electronic music became a thing. So there were two schools of thought in electronic music. One was the French, which was the musique concrète, and I don't know if I'm saying it right, probably not. And then the electronische Musik, which was the German school. So the French versus the German. And the French, where their approach to electronic music was to record sounds and to kind of process them and mix them in interesting ways to produce like different things. And then the German approach was like, no, we're going to create sounds from scratch. What was apparent by both sides is that something that seemed as simple as the song of a bird, it was like super complicated, and to reverse engineer that was like mind-boggling. Like, holy smokes, this is really hard to do. And so the same thing I think has happened in the machine learning areas. I'm going to be giving a presentation on Facebook advertising to a private mastermind group of Perry Marshall, which is called the New Renaissance Group. Some of you might even know what that is, might even be there. I'm going to be giving that presentation in June 12th. I'm going to make an announcement. But the reason I'm going in that tangent is because I'm going to be talking about a little bit about the machine learning. So I'm thinking that those advances in psychology, in neuroanatomy, in neuroscience, really can aid us in understanding a little deeper beyond our action. And that is actually important, because if we don't see, we might fall prisoner to these ideologies, to these simple, okay, and this is the reason that they're attractive, because in a lot of ideologies they have a lot of truth in them. The problem is that it's a lot of times like one-sided truth, and or like a hyper simplified truth that doesn't help to address the problem. So the question many times becomes, are you more interested in solving the problem, or are you more interested in that your idea gets accepted as the way to solve a problem, so that you get admired and then have status, or are part of the group, or you feel like you won, all these other things that are underlying the personal, emotional, motivational side of us that we all have, right? So the very fact that I'm making a video, well, why am I making a video? Well, I'm making a video because I like making videos. I'm making a video because I get a lot of input, so I want to output some of that. I'm making a video because I like to get some feedback from the video, but I'm also making a video because it makes me feel good. I'm also making a video because people sometimes they stop me in the street, or they or people that that are my friends on Facebook, and even others, like, hey, I watch your videos and they're really good, or I like them, and so that makes me feel good. So like that side is always there. So anyway, so and then going up here would be the philosophical, and then how many of us can say that we have had appropriate and proper philosophical training? And it's interesting, and well, let me just finish that thought. And then the religious, this is like taboo, right? We can't talk about this, but I just don't see a way around it. And you know me, I never make videos on like religion or anything really like that, and I don't consider myself a fanatic or anything like that, or fundamentalist and anything like that. But it seems to me that there's, thinking about it, there's no way around it. We end up with what at our foundation, right? At our very foundation of being, what are our presuppositions of what is good versus what is bad? And of course, the presuppositions on a society like, for example, in the U.S., is a Judeo-Christian presupposition, and that's hard to escape. And so to say that this is not important, I think it's naive. And so what I'm wondering is, when we have all these things that are happening, and I know that there's a lot of people who are suffering, and like I said, this is a complex problem. So it's not like we're gonna come up with a simple solution, because what I'm saying is exactly that. That is a difficult problem. So we shouldn't be looking for a simple solution, because there is no such thing. And so, so anyways, so one of my thoughts on here, and I guess I'm gonna call it quits here in just a sec. So one of my things about that, I was thinking about this earlier, was if we were to map history, the topic, the subject history, what would history fall under? Would it fall under science? Not really, although we can have some of that. We could certainly have the history of science, and then it will be science, but not really, right? History is something weird. And then would it be under a personal psychological thing? Well, yeah, obviously, because history would sort of, I guess there's at least two that I can think of, maybe more. You have the history as the representation of human nature throughout time. That's one. And then also history as the representation or the interpretation of the historian that we're reading. That as he's collecting all the facts, he's saying, and this is why I think a lot of people criticize historians. I know Nicholas Nassim Taleb, he's a he's a trader. He was a trader for a long time, and he's a really smart guy. He wrote The Black Swan is down here, which is a very important book. And he's written a couple of really good books, and I enjoy a lot of his stuff. But he really deeply criticizes historians, sort of because it's really easy to create a post hoc analysis on something, which I understand, but I think there's still value. I think there's still value in that. And so I think history sort of cuts across, right? The philosophical thing, philosophical being analyzing whatever thing as such, right? So if the action is the date, which dumb example that I came up with earlier, and then the objective or the thing is like, well, going on dates, right? And then the personal is going on dates. I like going on dates because I don't want to be alone, or because I really like this person or whatever. The philosophical thing is, why is going out on a date good as such, right? Or what is a date as such, right? And then I guess the religious would be, yeah, like it's good to go out on dates or not. So like from the Judeo-Christian thing, it's like, well, people, a man needs a compliment of a woman, and a woman needs a compliment of the man. I'm not gonna go into any other sort of relationships besides heterosexual just because of the sake of time. I'm definitely not trying to spark controversy. So I thought this was very interesting, and I thought, and again, the thing about that I said about art is also important. That we talk, that we teach, that we understand these underpinnings of our civilization, right? Perhaps we're not religious. Perhaps we're not going to church. Perhaps we're not doing any of these things, but it forms a hierarchy of goals, right? And so like Jung had this idea, Carl Jung had this idea that whatever person's highest ideal or highest or most important thing in their life, whatever that might be, that acts as a god to them for all intents and purposes, regardless of what they believe, right? And I think there's so much truth in that statement that it's kind of scary that it doesn't matter what somebody tells you, whether they tell you they believe, and I see people's profiles and meet girls and guys too, friends, and that they say, oh yeah, God is, well, I see this, the reason I think I said girls, and now I want to patch that up a little bit, is because I meet a lot of girls that say, well, God is everything for me, or God is number one, or God, which I understand, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing. But what I'm saying is, it's more important sometimes to know, and I think Carl Jung said this too. He says, if you don't know somebody's motivation, look at the outcome of whatever they do and infer the motivation. And I think that's so true. So we need these things, and like and I was thinking about that today, and I was thinking about that when a friend of mine posted about this kid shooting himself. there's just no way around this, and to close ourselves from this because we say, well, this is taboo, we're not going to talk about this, and philosophical, well, this is boring, so I'm not going to talk about that, and personal, well, this is secretive, so also I don't talk about that, and then science, well, this is kind of far removed, and as a matter of fact, the scientific method is supposed to remove value, like literally it removes the subjective, that's why it's called objective, it removes the subject from, but the problem is that by removing the subject, we remove ourselves, right? Because we are a subject. We're not an objective creature. You know, we have rationale and we try to compensate, hopefully, but really we are emotional and we're motivated to certain things, to thrive, to protect our family, right? We have all these other things that are, you know, given to us. So there's no way around this. So I guess to sum up the video, which I just probably went on so deep, but here's the other thing. There's no other way to approach something like this without going into depth and just getting completely lost. And this is why I think art is here. And now I understand, for example, when I wrote music, and I still write music. I have some music here, actually. That's why I was looking at it. I remember when I was in college and I was writing music, I felt that I was not being genuine when I was writing because I didn't exactly understand what was it that I was writing. But I realized that I had it completely backwards. And I think art is very much like that. Art is sort of the exploration through a specific of the universal. And I think that's why sometimes art and, for me, music, can hit us with such power, because it's almost like the auditory, the acoustical representation of all these layers of meaning sort of hitting you at one time, right? And then if you add, for example, I like a lot of Latin American music, dance music, and I've played in salsa bands and things like that, and I still have friends that play, and I enjoy that. And when people dance, it's almost, that is the motor layer of all the layers at once. And I think that's why dancing sometimes can feel so good, right? And then dancing with a partner. Now you're assimilating and kind of playing back and forth with every layer of meaning at once, a representation of it. I mean, I'm not saying that meaning is in music, but I think it is a representation of those stacked up layers of meaning. And maybe this is just a ramble, but I really do think that there's something to be said for that. And so if there's no reason why I gave the letters here, but I was just saying that life, L-I-F-E, was all these things stacked up, and I think more, right? As I started the video, I realized there's the whole human layer that I think is missing, but I don't know if it's already here. I think it might be. I think the human layer might be there, because we perceive the things that are happening, then our senses take it in, but before our senses take it in, and we know this because of, again, this is a little bit machine learning, but this is also, and I made a video about this called the frame problem. Basically, when people, like, for example, Rodney Brooks, which is he's like a roboticist. When we started trying to create robots or machines that perceive the world, we thought it was going to be pretty easy to get them to perceive, because hey, there's the world, and there are objects in the world. And then the hard thing would be, okay, now we have to get them to act in the world. But turns out it's not. It's actually the other way around. Acting is pretty easy once you are able to perceive. The problem is that we cannot make machines that perceive, or we're still solving that problem, and it's getting better, a lot better. If you guys want to check some really creepy stuff out, there's a company called Boston Dynamics. I think it's called Boston Dynamics, and they make robots. They are the guys that started creating this thing called Big Dog, I think, and it's just like this roboticized four-legged thing. And it's very, very interesting because, you know, soon, and this is why this is so important, because if as a society we don't have some of these things, and we've been attacking the religious underpinnings of our society for about 200, 300, maybe 400 years, right? When was Bacon and Descartes? And I think that much. For about, you know, that much, which I'm not saying it shouldn't be criticized. I think, you know, religion as a whole also has a lot of, you know, flaws and problems throughout the ages, right? And so I'm not saying that, but what I'm saying is that there has to be some kind of foundation, right? So like when we say a sentence, any sentence, that sentence cannot contain everything, cannot contain the world. The sentence needs to be supported on a whole series of things that you and I agree on, so that you can even understand what I'm saying, so that we can even have a conversation. And so this is the problem. And so in the midst of this super high complexity, it's so easy to say, well, we need this guy in office versus that guy, or we need gun control, or we need to have a wall, or we need, you know, all these sort of things. And I'm not saying that any of those things have a level of importance and that are reasonable to a certain extent. I think all those things are, and that is the trick. That is the hard thing, because we don't want to go through this analysis and try to figure out what the heck is going on, because I think collectively we don't know, and individually, heck, we don't know. I don't know. So it's a very hard problem. But okay, great. So let's summarize, just to end the video. But this was very helpful for me. Ooh, I really cleared some major thoughts in my head. So when we need to, from action all the way to our conception of what is good and what is bad, there are levels of abstraction that are implicit and that we have, and that's just it, all right? So it is important for us as a society to, and us as individuals mainly, because we can't, you know, I can't go out there and go, hey, society, right? And I have a post. I think it's a great sentence by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, where he talks about. He says that if only bad people were somewhere doing bad things, right? They're out there doing bad things, and so we can just grab all the bad people, and then we just take them somewhere else, or we get rid of them or something, right? And then he says the problem is that the line dividing good and bad runs through the middle of everybody's heart. And then he says, and who is willing to destroy part of his or her heart? So, and so it's very interesting when we talk about, and you hear this a lot, you hear people saying, what I just said, exactly what I just said. You hear people, or people do this, or don't you hate when people, or isn't it funny that people, or wow, I just can't believe that people. You always hear phrases like that. But what's interesting about that is that the person is also talking about themselves. I'm also talking about myself when I say people. Why? Because I'm people, right? We're all part of this. So it's very interesting that we criticize. So like, I was talking to this lady. She was from Canada, and at this conference earlier this year, and I was telling her that people generally fear change. And she was telling me, no, she didn't fear change or anything. Then we went on to a different subject, and then I told her that I really liked Vancouver. I thought Vancouver was a beautiful city, and because I love, they have beaches and have mountains and forests and all this stuff. So when she heard like the forest and the mountains, she was like, "Oh no, I'm a city girl. I don't like that." So I told her, "But I thought you liked change." So so she she didn't appreciate that too much. But basically, my thought on that was that it's if you